The scene is a sun-drenched beach. An older couple, silver-haired and smiling, walks hand in hand along the water's edge. It's an image so deeply ingrained in our culture, it's almost a cliché, the golden years. A time of leisure, travel, hobbies, a well-earned rest after a lifetime of labor. Retirement. It seems as natural, as inevitable as the setting sun. But what if I told you that this entire phase of life, this decades-long period of post-work existence, is an invention? And a surprisingly recent one at that. For almost all of human history, the concept of stopping work at a certain age and living on a pension would have been utterly alien, a fantastical dream. The very idea of old age as we understand it, a distinct, separate chapter of life, did not exist. You worked until you couldn't, and then you hoped your family would care for you. So how did we get from a world where life was a continuous, unbroken line of labor to one where we plan, save, and yearn for the day we can finally stop? This is the unseen, revolutionary history of how we invented retirement. For our ancient ancestors, life was a brutal, straightforward calculus. There were no retirement plans, no 401ks. There was only utility. In hunter-gatherer societies, an older individual who could no longer hunt or gather wasn't retired, they were a potential burden. Their survival depended entirely on their perceived value to the tribe, their wisdom, their knowledge of tradition, their ability to care for the young. To grow old was a rare achievement, often respected, but it was not a ticket to leisure. It was a race to remain useful until the very end. Even as we built the first great civilizations, this fundamental reality changed little. Consider the Roman Empire, a society of immense wealth and sophistication. The Roman concept of otium, a state of leisurely contemplation and intellectual pursuit, seems like an early form of retirement. But this was a privilege reserved for the tiniest sliver of the elite, the wealthy statesman, the philosopher, the landed aristocrat who had slaves to do the actual work. For the vast, overwhelming majority, the stonemason, the farmer, the shopkeeper, the baker, life was work. You inherited your father's trade, you practiced it until your body gave out, and then you became dependent on your children. The family was the only social safety net. A childless old age was a sentence of destitution. The Roman state did, however, pioneer one of the very first, albeit limited, forms of a pension system. After 25 years of brutal service, a Roman legionary was discharged. He wasn't given a monthly check, but often a plot of land in a newly conquered territory. This wasn't an act of pure benevolence, it was a brilliant piece of statecraft. It rewarded loyalty, incentivized long-term service, and crucially, it populated distant frontiers with trained, loyal veterans who could defend the land they now owned. It was a military and colonial tool, not a societal recognition of old age. For everyone else, the ancient world offered a simple, stark contract: be useful or be forgotten. This reality persisted for well over 1,000 years. Throughout the medieval period, life expectancy was brutally short. Reaching the age of 60 was an anomaly. The world was overwhelmingly agricultural, governed by the rhythms of the seasons. There was no retirement age because the farm always needed tending. An aging peasant would simply shift from the heavy labor of plowing to lighter tasks, mending fences, feeding chickens, weaving cloth. Their role evolved, their pace slowed, but the work never truly stopped. Old age was not a distinct phase, it was a gradual fading of capacity. In the nascent towns and cities, guilds offered a form of protection for their members, a kind of professional family. A master craftsman who grew too old might be cared for by the guild, his tools passed down to an apprentice. Monasteries too served as a refuge for the elderly and infirm who dedicated their lives to God. But these were exceptions, small islands of structured support in a vast ocean of self-reliance and familial obligation. For the common person, old age was less a destination and more a looming specter of dependency and poverty. So where did the first whispers of a universal right to rest begin? Curiously, one of the earliest, most radical proposals came not from a government, but from a revolutionary thinker, Thomas Paine. In his 1797 pamphlet, Agrarian Justice, Paine argued that every person, upon reaching the age of 51, should receive a sum of money from a national fund. This wasn't charity, he argued. It was a birthright, a compensation for the loss of natural inheritance that came with the rise of private land ownership. The idea was astonishingly ahead of its time, and, predictably, it was dismissed as an unworkable utopian fantasy. The world was simply not ready. The real catalyst, the great earth-shattering event that would make retirement not just possible, but necessary, was not a philosophical treatise. It was the roar of the steam engine. The Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries changed everything. Millions moved from the cyclical, seasonal life of the farm to the rigid, relentless, clock-driven life of the factory. And here, in the shadow of the smokestack, a new kind of cruelty was born. On the farm, an older worker could slow down and still be useful. In the factory, you either kept pace with the machine or you were useless. The new economy valued speed, stamina, and efficiency above all else. An aging worker with slowing reflexes and fading eyesight was no longer just less productive. They were a liability, a danger to themselves and others on the chaotic factory floor. The concept of being too old to work was born. Companies began to unceremoniously fire older workers, casting them out with no safety net, no savings, and no farm to return to. Old age, for the first time in history, became an industrial problem, a social crisis of mass destitution. The pressures mounted. Labor movements and socialist parties began to gain traction, decrying the heartlessness of industrial capitalism and demanding protections for the old and vulnerable. And it was in the heart of industrial Europe, in the newly unified Germany of the late 19th century, that the first modern, state-sponsored retirement system was born. But its creation was a masterclass in political maneuvering, a story of intrigue and calculation, not just compassion. The architect was Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. Bismarck was a staunch conservative, deeply suspicious of socialism, but he was also a pragmatist. He saw the growing power of the socialist movement and decided on a brilliant co-opting strategy. He would steal their thunder. He would create a welfare state that would tie the German workers' loyalty not to revolutionary parties, but directly to the German state. A man who has a pension for his old age is much more contented and far easier to manage, he remarked. And so, in 1889, Germany passed its Old Age and Disability Insurance Law. It was a landmark piece of legislation, the first of its kind. But let's look at the details. The retirement age was set at 70. This at a time when the average German life expectancy was barely in the mid-40s. It was a system designed to be paid into by many, but collected by very, very few. It was a social release valve, a political tool to quell unrest, not a generous promise of a leisurely old age. Yet despite its limitations, a powerful precedent had been set. The state had, for the first time, officially acknowledged a responsibility for its elderly citizens. The idea of retirement had moved from fantasy to state policy. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States clung fiercely to its ideal of rugged individualism. The very idea of a European-style state pension was anathema to many. The primary safety net, if you could call it that, was the massive Civil War pension system, which by the 1890s consumed over 40% of the federal budget. But this was a system for veterans, a reward for military service, not a universal right. As American industry boomed, some large corporations began to offer their own private pensions, starting with the American Express Company in 1875. But these were not benevolent gifts. They were powerful tools of labor control. Pensions were often used to discourage unionization, as a worker could lose their entire retirement fund for going on strike. They were a way to ensure loyalty and discard older, less efficient workers without sparking riots. For most Americans, the future remained precarious, dependent on personal savings and the goodwill of their children. Then came the Great Depression. The Roaring Twenties had created a culture of stock market speculation, with many believing they could invest their way to a comfortable retirement. In 1929, that dream evaporated overnight.
The stock market crash wiped out the life savings of millions. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Unemployment skyrocketed. The carefully constructed edifice of American individualism crumbled into dust.
Suddenly, the plight of the elderly was not an isolated problem, it was a national catastrophe. Elderly people who had lost everything were seen selling apples on street corners, living in shanty towns, their dignity stripped away. The family safety net collapsed as their own children lost their jobs. The demand for a national solution became an undeniable roar. Into this crisis stepped President Franklin D. Roosevelt. As part of his sweeping New Deal, he signed the Social Security Act of 1935. This was the single most important event in the history of retirement in America, and arguably the world. It was a monumental conceptual shift. It established, for the first time, a national, compulsory social insurance program that recognized old age as a collective societal responsibility. It was a promise: if you work and contribute, society will provide a basic income for you when you are too old to continue. The original act was far from perfect. It excluded agricultural workers, domestic servants, and government employees, disproportionately affecting women and minorities. The retirement age was set at 65, and the first payments were meager. But the idea was revolutionary. It institutionalized retirement. It created a clear, defined boundary between a working life and a post-work life. It transformed old age from a period of frightening uncertainty into a planned, anticipated, and socially supported life stage. The true golden age of retirement arrived in the decades after World War II. An unprecedented economic boom, coupled with the strength of labor unions, led to the rise of the three-legged stool of retirement security. The first leg was Social Security. The second was the dramatic expansion of private employer-funded pensions, known as defined benefit plans, which guaranteed a specific monthly income for life. The third leg was personal savings and investments, now bolstered by a stable economy. For a generation, the dream became a reality. A person could work for a single company for 30 or 40 years, receive a gold watch, and then comfortably live out their days on a combination of their company pension and Social Security. This was the era that created the modern cultural image of retirement: moving to Florida, playing golf, traveling the world. The concept had matured from a political tool into a widespread cultural aspiration, the final, well-deserved chapter in a life of hard work. But then, just as the dream seemed perfected, the ground began to shift again. The global economy changed. The certainties of the post-war era began to unravel. Companies, facing increased global competition, saw their generous defined benefit pensions not as a reward for loyalty, but as a crippling financial liability. And so another conceptual revolution began, this time a quieter, more insidious one. The defined benefit pension, where the risk was on the company, was slowly replaced by the defined contribution plan, most famously the 401k. The language itself is a tell. The company's contribution is now defined. The benefit you receive is not. The risk, the burden of saving enough, of investing wisely, of making it last, was shifted from the corporation squarely onto the shoulders of the individual. At the same time, life expectancy continued to rise. The Social Security system, designed when most people died shortly after reaching 65, was now strained by retirees living into their 80s and 90s. Healthcare costs soared, eating away at retirement savings. The three-legged stool began to wobble. For many, the golden age dream of retirement started to look like a relic from a bygone era. Today, we stand at another inflection point. The very concept of a linear life, education, followed by a 40-year career, followed by retirement, is dissolving. The gig economy, the rise of automation, the need for lifelong learning, all of these are dismantling the old structures.
People change careers multiple times. The idea of a job for life is an antique. This brings us back to our fundamental question. We invented retirement to solve the problems of the industrial age. It was a brilliant, necessary solution for its time. But is that invention still fit for purpose in the 21st century? We are witnessing the emergence of encore careers, where people retire from one profession only to start another. We see a rise in phased retirement, where people gradually reduce their hours instead of stopping cold turkey. We are grappling with how to fund a 30-year retirement in an era of wage stagnation and market volatility. The history of retirement reveals a profound truth. The stages of our lives are not natural or inevitable. They're social constructs, ideas we build to organize our societies and make sense of our existence. We invented childhood to protect and educate the young. We invented the teenager in the 20th century, and we invented retirement to create a space for dignity and security at the end of a working life. But inventions can be reinvented. The stark contract of the ancient world, work until you can't, is re-emerging not as a brutal reality, but as a complex personal choice, a financial necessity, or a desire for continued purpose. The unseen history of retirement is a story of how we, as a society, have chosen to define the final chapter of a human life. And that story is not over. The invention of old age is not finished. It is simply entering its next, uncertain, and deeply human chapter.
If you found this deep dive into the invention of retirement valuable, the best way to support our work is to hit the like button and subscribe to Ages Unseen. It helps us reach more curious minds and continue to produce these explorations into the ideas that shape our lives. Thank you for watching.